Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this presentation of mine, which is called The Evolution of Black History. And what we're going to look at in this session is looking at race, genetics, and civilization. My name is Abu-Bakr Madden al-Shabazz. I'm a historian and a social scientist, which means there's three different disciplines: psychology, sociology, and anthropology. I was also trained in economics at Cardiff University. I'm a visiting lecturer for Cardiff University, and I was the first person to run a Black and History Studies program from 2009 for approximately 9 years, and now I'm a visiting lecturer. So let's start the presentation. When Black history is taught, there are usually three approaches which is used according to Orlando Patterson. Orlando Patterson is a sociologist. I think it's Harvard University, if my memory serves me right. One of the things that he emphasizes is that when Black history is taught within the Western Hemisphere, there are three aspects it deals with: catastrophic, contributionism, and survivalist. The two which really is focused on in the Western world is the catastrophic and the survivalist, as the catastrophic deals with destruction, mayhem, and the survivalist is looking at resistance. So we're looking at colonization and enslavement. The contributionism is mainly focused upon Black people, especially those from the Afrocentric movement, or those from the African continent, or those in the diaspora, those Black people that live outside of Africa. And we like to look at the contributionism. So we look at the high elements of culture, because unfortunately, as far as colonialism was concerned, we were considered primitive, savage, and barbarian, and we didn't contribute anything to civilization, which we now know is untrue. So the contributionism looks at the high elements of culture, and this is what we'll focus on in the later part of the presentation. This looks at the likes of ancient Sumeria, which was a Black civilization, which I will elaborate on further, and we'll also touch upon ancient Egypt. So let's have a look at racial compositions in the ancient world. Now, the ancient Egyptians themselves saw themselves as Black people, as this image here, which was found in the tombs of Ramses III, indicates. The first one, which is the A, which is here, is how the ancient Egyptians saw themselves. The land of ancient Egypt, otherwise known as Egypt today, was known as Kemet. Okay, Kemet means the Black lands, and the people call themselves Kemitu, which means the Black ones. Okay, so there was no problem with ancient Egyptians describing themselves as dark-skinned or Black people. But unfortunately, with Eurocentrics who are working within the fields of Egyptology, there's this element of denial, suppression, destruction, and to intentionally confuse the facts that Black people did have a high culture and civilization, whereby our history should not start in colonization, colonialism, and the enslavement period. So the ancient Egyptians see themselves as A. If you look at B, these are the Indo-Europeans. You can see there's an element of admixture with them. They're quite dark skinned, even though they're light. You can actually see that admixture. The third are the rest of Africans, okay, which is south and west of Egypt, which would be Libya, and obviously the Nubians. So you can see that they had no problem identify themselves with the rest of Black Africans. And obviously D are the Semitic types. And people have immersed themselves in the element of miscegenation or genetic amalgamation. So in the ancient world, there were three types or types of people, groups of people, or races as we call them today. So Carl von Linnaeus came in the 18th century. Linnaeus was a Swedish naturalist, and he divided people into four different races. So I just gave you the ancient classification of people. So he came during a time of colonization, colonialism, the enslavement period. And as you can see from his taxonomy or his classification, you will notice there were four distinctive races that Carl von Linnaeus had stipulated in his writings: Afro-Americanus, Afro-Europaeus, Homo Asiaticus, and Homo Afa. So it should be Homo Americanus, Homo Europeanus, okay, Asiaticus, and Afa. Now, what I want you to cast your mind on is that what von Linnaeus does here is that he looks at two different types of aspects when he's trying to describe people of so-called different races. Because what was taking place when the Europeans were going out to colonize the rest of the world, they started to notice that people living in those lands, in Asiatic lands, in Africa, in the so-called Americas, they started to notice that those people's complexions, languages, and skin tones were totally different to theirs. And this is how these so-called racial classifications came about. So race is a social construct, and it was based upon pseudo-scientific principles at this very beginning. And what this basically means is that race was seen as a physical and biological specification, whereby Europeans or whites were considered superior or had elements of superiority over the other races, which were the black, brown, yellow, and reds, who were in the more the subordinate category, who were considered savage and barbarians or primitive, as opposed to Europeans who were considered civilized. So what Linnaeus does here, and you're going to do this exercise for yourself, which I will show you later, is he basically looks at skin color to some extent, the continents which they come from. The phenotype here deals with the different aspects or dimensions of the face. You're looking at eyes, nose, lips, ears, head, those type of things. Okay, this is what the phenotype is, and looking at the different variations amongst people. But what he also does is the element of characterization. He started to characterize them. He started to put behavior aspects, like if you look at Homo Hafa, which is the African or the dark-skinned people, he saw them as being cunning, lazy, lustful, careless, and governed by caprice, which means that they didn't have the sophistication of rational thought and constructive behavior. This is what he tries to pose at the time. So this comes around about the 1800s. And the next one is the likes of Blumenbach. So Blumenbach built on the taxonomy of Linnaeus, and he came with another one. So he came with a fifth dimension, which is the Malayan groups of people, which was the brown races. The other thing I want you to cast your mind to is that around about 1775, 1776, it was Blumenbach who coined the word Caucasian. So this is where the word Caucasian now comes into the English language, where many Europeans will call themselves that. It was Blumenbach who socially constructed this term because he believed at the time, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest this, that white people came from the Caucasus Mountains. This is where they were situated, and that's how that entered the English language. So let's have a look at two approaches that scientifics used during the time of colonization and colonialism. You've got the monogenetic perspective and the polygenetic. And I'm going to explain these two to you now. And these are terms you should familiarize yourself with. So the monogenetic theory, okay, is based upon different racial groups all belonging to the same human family, irrespective of their variation in genotypes and phenotypes. So what that means, irrespective of their skin color, irrespective of their eyes, their hair color, etc., they all come from one. They're all mutations and they all come from one. This is one theory which was passed during the 1700s and the 1800s. And then you've got the polygenetic theory, where each racial group has a different origin, so they're not connected genetically to one another. This is what was believed, okay? And they're not related in any way to the human family through genes or blood. Now we know that the monogenetic theory is now a monogenetic fact as a result of genetics and DNA. So what is important here for what I want you to understand is that the monogenetic theory is now proved as a fact since the study in Berkeley University and the University of Hawaii, which I will talk about later, by Rebecca Cann and her team, had actually established that the oldest people on the planet are Black people or African people. They emerged in Africa approximately 90,000 to 200,000 years ago, and they moved out of Africa through the elements of diffusion. Diffusion means to spread into other regions, becoming the autochthonous or the indigenous people or the first settlers in those regions. This is now a scientific fact. So I will talk about that. So the answer for this one, the monogenetic theory, is actually a monogenetic fact. Okay, Europeans and mutations from Africans or dark-skinned people. And this is why people are fascinated with DNA. Let's have a look at the concept of morphology, because this is another terminology which you're going to come about in your lifetime. So what is morphology? So morphology is based upon four basic principles: shape, size, texture, color, what I call stick. Okay, stick, SSTC. Shape, size, texture, and color. So morphology is the study of forms and things that have a particular shape or structure in its dimension. So we look at here, you can look at the morphology. Here is the phenotype. So phenotype is nose, lips, hair, skin. That is phenotype. They're the physical characteristics we can observe or which we possess. However, morphology tries to break those down into particular dimensions. So as an example, shape of the nose. You can also have shape of the lips or shape of the hair, whatever the case may be. Size, another morphological characteristic, size of the lips, texture of the hair, color of the skin. So all these here represent morphology. Nose, lips, hair, skin, etc., etc. That is phenotype. This is what is important here. So let's have a look at W.E.B. Du Bois, who basically said at the turn of the 20th century that the problem of the 20th century is the color line. And W.E.B. Du Bois was a scholar. He was a historian, a sociologist, and economist. He was one of the major founders of the NAACP, which was the first movement in order to try to bring about racial equality within North America. It was first called the Niagara Movement before it was called the NAACP. So what is important here is that W.E.B. Du Bois was the first Black graduate to receive a PhD from Harvard University. This is what is really important here. And he went out of his way to look at race through the ages. So what is here? We look at morphology and phenotype. So the morphology, which I talked about, shape, color, texture. So what W.E.B. Du Bois talks about in his book, which is called Souls of the Black Folk. There's a page number here. You can read even further. It's a book which is studied at university. So he basically says that the fascinations that European had during the 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century was color, bone, and hair. And this is how they divided the races into superior, inferior, because there was a belief that the lighter you were, the more superior you was. Okay, your bone structures, if you were white, was considered superior, and if you had straighter hair, you were considered superior. This is what came out of this classification during the 1700s, 1800s, so on and so forth. So when we look at race, they focus on skin, bone, and hair. So morphology looks at what? Morphology here is dealing with the shape, texture, okay? And obviously when we're looking at the skin. So the thing which I want to emphasize here is that the phenotype and the morphology, they come together, shape of this, texture of that. And this is what he talks about. So the fascination with Europeans is color, bone, and hair in order to distinguish the different racial groups. So what he says here, although the wonderful development of human history teaches that the grosser physical differences of color, hair, and bone go but a short way towards explaining the different roles which groups of men have played in human progress. So color, hair, and bone does not describe human behavior. This is what he's trying to emphasize, trying to say. And unfortunately, scientists try to put that together as a way of trying to divide the relationships, to classify them, to characterize them, and to put them into categories. He goes on to say even further, color does not agree with texture of hair, for many of the dark races have straight hair, because there was a belief at one time that all Black people had curly hair. This is not true. People cannot be fixed, and this is why there's only one race, the human race, one human family. Even though there may be different races, they're all connected to one another. So it's the monogenetic fact. He also goes on to say about the dark races, you know, having straight hair, nor does color agree with breadth of head. So the shape of the skull. For the yellow Tatars, the Mongoloid groups of people, the yellow people, sometimes they call them Asiatics or Orientals, have broader head than the German, because it was believed that the Nordics or the Aryans or the Northern Europeans had bigger heads. Therefore, they must have had bigger brains. That's been blown out of the water now. This was blown in the water because this book was written around about 1903, 1904. Around about that time, this book was written. So this is well over 100 years ago. So you can see the type of mindset that existed in Europe during this particular period. So he goes on to say that we have at least two or perhaps three great families, not races, families, because there was a notion at the time that all people come from one. Even though scientific colonialism and racism and all these other type of scientific biasness had taken over people's minds, the thing to emphasize here, which is of great importance, that he focused on the great human family, not races, to separate people, not the polygenetic theory. So he goes on to say that there were three possible races, and these are the things we're going to look at, and that's some of the things you're going to have to work on over the weekend. What then is race? It is a vast family of human beings, not races, family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always a common history, tradition, and impulses, who are both voluntarily and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of certain more or less vividly conceived ideals of life, which basically means that even though we may belong to so-called different races or racial groups or ethnic groups, whatever the case may be, we all have one thing in common: we're striving. We have to use what is known as human activities. And what that means, we have to move, we have to bring about change with our actions, whether through our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, whatever the case may be. So we all have the same thing where food, clothing, and shelter is concerned. So there's the page numbers of W.E.B. Du Bois' classification of races. Now for the task, which I'm going to leave you with, you're going to have to determine which one of these races belong to which one. So what is important here? You've got Australoid, Capoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, American, and Caucasian, or Caucasoid. So what you're going to have to do is to align the right image with the racial classification or racial classification next to the number, whatever you want to do. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to show you the work which I expect you to do. So if you look at this here, let me just bring this up. You can see that. So what you're going to have to do, here's your first task: determine which race is which. So here, which one would that be? If you think that this particular individual is Australoid or number one, you put Australoid 1 in this box here. If you think that this one is a Capoid 2, put Capoid or 2 in there, so on and so forth. That's all you have to do. And in order to help you distinguish between the different physical features of phenotypes and morphologies, go back to these two slides here, which is actually on the sheet of paper, the works of Linnaeus and Blumenbach. And this will help you to establish answering these questions. That's all you have to basically do. So that's one of your exercises. It won't take you more than 20 minutes to half an hour to do this. Most of you already know this. You will know at least 3 or 4 of them, but that's something for you to investigate and for you to engage yourself in before the major conference, which is next week. So let me just stop this now, and all I will do is carry on with my presentation. So let's have a look now. So here, so that's all you have to do. So that's going to be your task 1 or your little exercise. So let's go on to the next one now. So now we're going to look at the genetic research or genetic scientific research. And I think this is important because what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at the ways in which people journey. DNA is a fascinating subject, so I thought if I just give a little summary of how to understand it and how we evolved as human beings, etc., we'll have a greater, not just a greater understanding, but a greater appreciation of racialization in a sense, where people are different, people are idiosyncratic by nature. What I mean by that, they have different attitudes, different behaviors, different outlooks, different thoughts, different feelings, okay? So this is what is important here. So 2 people are not the same. So here is Newsweek. So Newsweek here is a magazine which published these two individuals here on the left-hand side. It was called The Search for Adam and Eve. This was in the late 1980s. So Dr. Rebecca Kant of the University of Hawaii conducted a study with Berkeley University looking at mitochondrial DNA. So mitochondrial DNA is a DNA strands that are passed from mother to daughter, mother to daughter. Mothers can pass on to their sons, but their sons cannot pass or transfer those genes on. Okay, it dies in the males. It transfers from female to female. It's called mitochondrial DNA. They had studied over 147 or exactly 147 female samples were taken for the study, different races and different groups, different ethnicities and tribes and clans, etc. And many of them were based in America. So there was 147 different types of women, different phenotypes and morphologies. They use women placentas in order to extract the DNA, because DNA, which is extracted from there is much richer, okay, as far as identifying, analyzing, and evaluating that genetic material. And obviously L1, L2, L3 are nomenclatures. These are names given for the genetic branches which they found. And what they found from these 147 women in the late 1980s, that every single one of them were related to one woman that lived in Africa, approximately 90,000 to probably 200,000 years ago. So the cradle of civilization, the cradle of culture is in Africa itself. Most of us know this. Many polygeneticists try to deny that Africa had any major contribution as far as culture and civilization was concerned, but this where science blew this out of the water, that the original people on the planet were dark-skinned people or African people, and they existed in East Africa, which is the homeland of humanity. So here is just a picture of the two. You can see their dark skin, Adam and Eve. You know, they're using the biblical story to tell this, because this is the sort of things they're going to be using. Y chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve. It's just a way of referencing for us to understand where humankind begins. This is how this comes about. So on the top image here is the face of mitochondrial Eve. The 147 related to this one woman, and from those genetic materials they extracted from the placentas of these women, they were able to make a facial reconstruction of our mother that lived over 90,000 to approximately 200,000 years ago. She gave birth to her daughter or daughters known as L1, which is this one here, the Sand people. The Sand people are the oldest people on the planet. They're sometimes referred to as Hottentot. They are Southern Africans. They have yellow to black skin. They're the people that Nelson Mandela is a descendant from. They also got the epicantic fold, which the Chinese, Japanese, and the Koreans inherited from them. This is what's important here. This distinctive characteristic, phenotype and genotype, as well as morphology, originated in Africa. And what happened, those phenotypes and other forms of genetic material were passed on to different so-called races eventually. So the Sand people are the oldest people on the planet, and then eventually they give birth to the Mbuti people, which are Central African or the Sub-Saharan African. I don't like the word Sub-Saharan because sub is short for subordinate, yeah, or subhuman. You shouldn't use these terms. These are racist terms. I'd rather say West Africa or Saharan Africa. We don't used to put the sub there because there's no European subcontinent. Yeah, they do the same with India, the Indian subcontinent. Why is it black and brown places called sub, and European, which is not even a continent, is called not sub? You know, it's just called Europe. And this is a way of demeaning the people because of the monogenetic theory they wanted to deny for the polygenetic theory. They were polygeneticists. This is what they were. So it was a way of separating the races. So the San, L1, gives birth to the Mbuti, which is L2, and then L3. Okay, and then this is where the Europeans, the L3 are the Kikuyu people of Kenya. And then we start to see two daughters revolve from them, M and N, and they go to populate the rest of the world. So here is how it goes. So L1, they start off in East Africa, you can see, move down, settle in Southern Africa. They're the first ones, the oldest people on the planet. Then you've got L2, the Saharan Africans, Central African, Saharan Africans. And L3, which is a later mutation, they emerge and they reside in East Africa, the Kikuyu people in Kenya. And then she gives birth to two daughters. Some of those daughters M, stay in Africa, but the daughters N move out of Africa. Some settle in the so-called Middle East. It's best to call it Arabia, and then they go on to Asia, because Middle East doesn't exist. That's another social construction by the Europeans. Okay, it doesn't exist because it doesn't make sense, the Middle East. There's no Middle West, there's no Middle North, there's no Middle South. And you have to have polarities when we're dealing with things. So if there's no opposite to Middle East, it doesn't exist. It's socially constructed. Europe is not a continent because Europe is Western Asia. Okay, Europe is not separated from Asia. It's Western Asia or Northwestern Asia, if you're looking at it from this perspective here. So L1, L2, L3, M stay in Africa. They go out of Africa, M and N. They're still African people. They're still dark-skinned people. This is important now. And then obviously the branches, M and N branches, end up in Australia. They ended up there between 60 to 70,000 years ago, the dark-skinned Australians. They're still dark, living in Asia. There's only one group of people on the planet, which is dark-skinned people. There are different types of phenotypes. Okay, curly hair, straight hair, broad nose, straight nose, but they were dark skin. And this is important because these are equatorial regions, very hot, and you need melanin to shield you from the ultraviolet rays of the sun. It's not about superiority, inferiority. This is about facts to deal with climatic changes and how to cope under those conditions. This is what it's about. It's a protective element. It's not about superiority and inferiority. And you can see all these different branches that come out here. All these branches here, which you find in Europe, which are mutations, these groups are still African. They're still African. However, they are mutating and creating daughters in Europe. This is what's important here. When a lot of people are having these splicings done about DNA, you're so much percentage, this is so much percentage that. What many Europeans don't know, and not being told, unfortunately, that if you're 34% European, for instance, you're 30% or 34% of that mutation that took place in Europe, but the genetic markers belong to Black African people. This is what's important here. They just happen to mutate outside Africa. It took approximately 150,000 years before white or Europeans came on the scene as a cluster group with white skin, straight hair, green eyes, blue eyes. All them are mutations from the original. It's not about superiority, inferiority. It's about climatic changes. I'm going to talk about what takes place and how the Europeans came about. How did lighter skin come about? Because it was a particular period. So all these mutations are Black Africans. Some have got curly hair, some got straight hair. So if you look at Australia, for instance, they got black skin, dark, very dark skin, but they got straight hair. You go to places like the Maoris, who are an Africoid people. They're dark-skinned people. Many of them mixed somewhat with British invasion from the late 1700s onwards, you know, but generally they were dark-skinned people with curly-ish straight hair, the Maori people. And you can see that they're African people. They're from the early clusters that migrated with the Australians and beachcombing down till they settled in these places because there was land bridge all over the place and over into the Americas. Okay, this is a map looking at it flat, you know, rather than what you call it in a globe. So America, this is the way they migrated. They got into America this way. Okay, South America. Okay, Caribbean islands, Central America. Okay, this is what's important here. So let's have a look at the different stages in human development. Most of you did prehistory in school. And one of the things is I'm going to try to familiarize yourself with this because when prehistory is taught in school, you're not taught that it's an African presence. It's a dark presence in Europe. Okay, white people didn't even exist then. And this is not to take away anything from their contribution over the last 400 to 500 years. This is scientific facts and archaeological evidence, paleoanthropological evidence, paleontological evidence, okay? Anthropology is all substantiating these claims that they came later, they're later mutation. So you've got the Upper Paleolithic Age, or the Old Stone Age, where you have between 55 and 30,000 years BC. Okay, so these are all dates. I'm not going to run through all of them, but what I want to put your mind to is that during the Upper Paleolithic period, up until 20,000 years ago, okay, all the skulls were dolichocephalic. Dolichocephalic skulls are African skulls or Africoid skulls. They're elongated skulls shaped like bows. These are African skulls. They existed in Europe, in Asia, in Russia, in America, etc., up until 20,000 years. Okay, so when you look at this particular period from 55,000 to about 20,000 years, you know you deal with the dark-skinned people. So some of these mutations that took place in Europe are by dark-skinned people. The Stone Age, up until this point, you had dark-skinned people. Okay, then you got the Mesolithic Age, the Middle Stone Age. When you're talking about 700 to 2700 BC, we start to now see the mesocephalic appearance. These are the European type skulls. They're slightly bigger, they're much harder because of the colder climate. It was to stop the brain from freezing. It's not about superiority, inferiority, and bigger brains. Having a bigger skull doesn't mean you've got a bigger brain. Okay, you got a bigger skull in order to deal with those climatic changes, because there was a glaciational period, which I will speak about, which was freezing for approximately 15 to 20,000 years. And that's when the mutation took place of Africans becoming much lighter, nose bridges becoming much narrower. Okay, the hair, which was curly and afro, started to become straighter to protect them from the cold climates of the ice. This is how this comes about. So what you have here, you've got all these different periods. The Neolithic Age, which comes around about 6,000 BC, we start to see the brachycephalic. These are even broader skulls now, much harder skulls of your Mongoloid groups, which is your Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, etc. And you also have your Semitic types, which is a mixture. And what has happened is when groups started to mutate, they started to mix with one another, producing a cluster group of people. Okay, it is one human family. Like I said, there's only one race, the human race. We're all mutations of one another from the original, though. And this is what's important here. If you go to Australia, for instance, you'll see Australians who've got black skin, who've got blonde hair, blue and green eyes. So Africans got all of these phenotypes. Even white skin Africans have. Africans are the only people, and the mutation is obvious because if you look at my hands, it's dark skin, black. All Africans have got lighter skin, hands and feet. So something must have happened to make this cover that in those climatic changes in the ice. So this is evidence to show you that one is a mutation. This is a dominant gene. This is recessive. This is how this came about through epigenesis, the relationship between climate, biology, genes, all this comes together to bring about those changes. And this is just showing you the Upper Paleolithic Age. This is an African skull, which was found in a place in Northern Europe. It's probably Austria, Germany, the Agranian period. Okay, that's what they call it. They got different periods for these eras. And obviously you got the Venus of Wellendorf. This is an African woman. You've also found similar of these figurines in South Africa. So when those women left as L3 to populate the rest of the world, okay, you see the peppercorn hair, that's Afro hair, there's no doubt about that. The voluptuous bodies, etc., etc. You can see that's an African woman. So this was found in Europe. So we know up until about 30,000 years ago, okay, there was only dark-skinned people. Okay, they didn't mutate into becoming a so-called European. So this is what's important here when we're looking at dates and we're looking at artifacts, which are facts, facts in arts, artifacts, facts in arts. So let's have a look at some of the migrations. I actually showed you the migrations, the genetic migrations. There's another genetic migration. This was taken from the works of Alice Roberts. Alice Roberts' The Incredible Human Journey, which is this book here. And you can see the similar tracks. This is a footprint tracks now. I show you the genetic tracks. This says exactly the same thing. So you've got two sciences now determining the out of Africa theory, which is a fact. Then you've got another form of migration, looking at the diffusion of different groups, still African, how they move, the diffusion. Diffusion means movement and then settlement. That's what diffusion means. They leave out of Africa from two exits. They go into the Arabian Peninsula, onto Europe, which is really Western Asia. All that is Asia, okay? The Levant, which is here, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, etc. You know, you got the Arabian Peninsula, these are the Gulf states. Here you got Mesopotamia or modern day Iraq. They were still African people. So you see that journey of Africans. So they don't become white until thousands of years. If you want to look further of understanding genetic mutation in skin attenuation or pigment, read the works of Nina Jablonski. Nina Jablonski says it takes 20 to 30,000 years, or 20 to 15 rather, thousand years for the mutations to take place. And that's how long the warm interstadial lasted. The warm interstadial was the last major glaciational period where for thousands of years there was ice caps in the northern aspects of the globe. And I will show you some images and explain how that came about. So here is just so you can see there's a linguistic evidence now. So you haven't got genetic evidence, anthropological evidence, you also got genetic evidence, and you also got historical evidence. So you got four different sciences saying exactly the same thing. You can see where they start in East Africa, okay, L1, L2. This is language diffusion now, language movement. The Semitic language comes out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, and you can see the East Africans, the Egyptians, and the Berbers, and the West Africans, all from the same family. They split off different ways. So the Asian Egyptians are dark-skinned people, according to linguistics. The Asian Egyptian language, it's an Afro-Asiatic language. It should be called the African language, because that language doesn't really diffuse into Europe or into the Levant or into the Arabian Peninsula. It stayed within the African continent. The Berbers, who are an African group, they come from, so they share the same lineage. Okay, they share the same lineage with West Africans. The Berbers may be white in your opinion, but they are Germanic people that came in around about the 5th century when the Romans were kicked out. That's when they appear. This is history. And the Egyptians were black, obviously, you can see from that. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is the fact that you still got the out of Africa fact now. I give you 4 disciplines, all saying the same thing: anthropological, historical, genetic, and linguistic. So let's have a look at this pigmentation. So all I'm trying to say that black people or darker skinned people, when they left Africa to populate the rest of the world, they were still dark skinned. So how does this come about? So one of the things I want to emphasize on this particular point here was that lighter skin came about to create Cro-Magnon. Cro-Magnon is a name they give a European skull, a European skull. And how did it change from an African skull? It changed through different forms of phenotypical evolutions based upon the climatic changes. So a lack of sun was one of the first things that attenuated the pigmentation in the skin. When they left and they were caught up in Europe, these Africans, they had to shed some of that skin to deal with the cold climates. Okay, the cold was increased in those climates because the ice was a mile thick. They were locked. They couldn't get back into the equator, these Africans. So they were locked up in the northern part of the equator, you know, the northern part of the globe. Okay, the reduction in vitamin D. Okay, and because of the simple factors, we need that vitamin D in order to maintain bones, etc. When there's a lack of sun and lack of heat, the bones become brittle, etc. So they had to shed some of that skin to cope with the colder climates. Okay, in order to produce vitamin D under those conditions. And bodily adaptation was inevitable. According to Stephen Oppenheimer, he is a geneticist and he's worked with Alice Roberts. She talks about him a lot in her books. She mentions that the first visitors to the north of Europe and Asia probably started their journey looking very dark-skinned and evolved to become paler later. Stephen Oppenheimer is a white person geneticist who has no problem with that. White people in mutations from darker skinned people. This is not about superiority, inferiority. It's about genetic facts and we all belong to one family, the human family, one race, the human race. Nicholas Wade, another geneticist, journalist, he says that the first human beings who migrated out of Africa almost certainly had dark skin. So when you look at the genetic markers that are found in Asia and all these places, and people are assuming they look like the people today, they don't understand history. And the fact is that what this actually tells us is that something happened in order for the phenotypical traits to change into what we would now consider particular so-called racial groups. Here's the glaciational period. So Africans left Africa approximately 70,000 years ago. They ended up coming out of Africa and migrating to all these places, beachcombing into, and they inherited all these places here. And what happened was there was a term known as a worm interstadial, the last glaciation. And you can see the ice caps at the top here. The Africans were locked here, okay? No sun, no heat. Then what started happening then, they had to go for those albinism. Africans started producing albino children. If you want to read more on this, read African Peasant Early Europe and look at the works of Charles Finch, who's a scientist. He breaks this down, you know, and he talks about terresinase plus and terresinase minus, etc., and how this mutation takes place, how the depigmentation process happens under these climates as far as mutation is concerned. But this is how this really and truly comes about. So the emphasis here is for you to understand is that when Africans left, they were living, they settled, migrated, started building small industries, etc. And then something happened in order to bring about that change. So the worm interstadial was the last glaciational period, and it lasted for approximately 20,000 years, 15 to 20,000 years. And that's when the mutation took place. Africans left approximately 70,000 years. They actually ended up in Europe probably about 50 to 55,000 years ago. They're still African. The Australian Aborigines had come here around about 60,000 years. It took them 10,000 years approximately to settle here, to journey to settle here. This is important news. So what happens then later on? Around about 50 to 55,000 years ago, Africans are there, they're caught up in the ice. So between 50,000 years to approximately 30,000 years is the worm interstadial. And that's when the mutation story takes place. So it's after between 30 to 20,000 years, we now see Cro-Magnon man or European man, European woman, as we know them today. So as a cluster group, as a genetic group, if we want to use this term, Europeans are only 20,000 years old, maybe 30 tops. Africans can go back at least 90,000 to 200,000 years ago, according to genetic evidence done by Rebecca Cannon and her team, and later geneticists such as Stephen Oppenheimer, you know, Alice Roberts, and other geneticists are mentioning this. So this is what's important here, how people started to mutate. So this proves of the monogenetic fact, mono meaning one or single gene. This is what monogenetic means, a single gene. Poly means many. We don't come from many genes. We come from one single gene. But only one race, one human race, one family, one human family. This is just to show you the African skull. This was a skull which was found. It's an African skull, dolichocephalic, platyrrhini, wide nasal passages, and you've got what you call prognathism, where the jaw comes out. This is the oldest bone which is found in Europe, 50 to 55,000 years old. It's been recorded. You have a similar skull found in Africa. You can see very little changes is taking place. You can still see the prognathism, the platyrrhini, the wide nasal passages, and you can also see the dolichocephalic, the boat-shaped skull, where the skull comes out here. These are typical African skulls. This is a modern African. So this is found in Europe, 50 to 50. So we know who lived in Europe. So when you've got these genetic markers, which make up maybe 34% of your so-called DNA through this splicing, the genetic companies and organizations like to do, they're not telling you that the genetic mutation that you have, which is in Europe, was of a dark-skinned African female. If we're looking at mitochondrial DNA, if it's Y chromosomal material, we're dealing with a dark-skinned man. These are scientific facts. So many people are paying thousands of pounds to prove with their DNA to move away from the African gene, not knowing that the early mutations they're talking about, around about this period and later, right up until maybe between 30 to 20,000 years, were African. And from 25 to 20,000 years, you're talking of Europeans. That's when they come as a cluster group. Yeah, the Oriental groups with the yellow skin, the epicanthic fold, and the short frame figure, they don't even come until about 15,000 years. Okay, this is important here. So we know from genetic evidence, we also know from archaeological evidence, from excavations which is being done, from paleontology, paleoanthropology, anthropology, and other forms of sciences, they're all linked saying the same thing. This is what's important here. So what we're going to finish off with now is culture to civilization. So another thing you're going to do is task 2, is looking at the cultural development. And what I want you to do is just to elaborate on these meanings: primitive, evolution, diffusion, autochthonous, which means indigenous. Allochthonous means migrant people that settle in the place, native, and culture. So primitive comes from the word prime, which means first or best. It doesn't necessarily mean primitive, which means backward and savage. This is historical understanding to primitive. Primitive comes from prime, which means first or best. I want you to give me your interpretation of what primitive means from a historical perspective. I'm giving you the general understanding of what it basically means. But I just want you to understand these terminology, especially those of you who want to go into history. Evolution, cultural evolution is where it begins. So when the genetic material begins, it begins in East Africa. Okay, evolution, cultural evolution, or genetic evolution, where it begins. Diffusion means where it spreads. And I showed you the anthropological evidence, linguistic evidence, and I showed genetic evidence and the historical evidence of the out of Africa theory, which is a fact. You've got 4 different disciplines saying the same thing. We all came out of Africa to populate the rest of the world. So that is basically looking at diffusion. Autochthonous means the first settlers ever on that land. It means the indigenous. Indigenous means the first people. Indigenous is not the same as native. Okay, every indigenous is a native, and not all natives are indigenous. I'm a native of this country, means I was born in this country. Okay, I'm a native of this country, but does it mean that I am the original? I am the indigenous? No, I'm not the original. That's the difference. A lot of people confuse native as being indigenous, and this is not true. And if you look at genetic evidence, this is what is blowing this out of the water. History has literally had to change in Europe because of what DNA has done. It's really disturbed historiography, historicity, to a large extent, genetics, because of what took place from the 1500s right up into colonization. That 450 to 500 year period of falsification of history, to distort history, to destroy history, to suppress, to falsify, in order to intentionally confuse. This is what it's about. So this is what is happening now. Allochthonous are the groups of people that move into an area, okay? Which means that allochthonous people, migrant settlers, mean that there's people which preceded them there. They're either native or indigenous. And there are 3 types of things you understand from a historical perspective. It's isolation. Isolation, the first people to live in that country, and they don't mix with other people. Isolation, then you got migration. From isolation, you got migration, where people move in. Then you have miscegenation. Miscegenation, where the races mix together. And this is what has been happening for over 90,000 years, where different groups of people have mixed with each other from different tribes and clans and so-called races, if you want to call it races at the time. Because there was no races until really, if you look at it from that perspective, at least 20,000 years ago, we saw 2. European, African, if you want to look at our Indo-European, African, whatever the case may be. And then obviously the later ones were the mixtures between those 2, which are your Semitic groups, which are your brachycephalic groups. These are your Mongoloid, your Chinese, your Japanese. They come much later, okay? They come as a strong group to inherit that part of the world by taking over the dark-skinned populations of China and India and Indonesia and Malaysia. There were dark-skinned people living there. About 50,000 years, the yellow-skinned people with shorter stature, they started to become numerous and they took over those lands. This is what happens. So you got allottonist people, people who move in. Native, I've already explained to you, and culture deals with five or six principles, maybe 7 principles. The first one is language, communication. That's what culture is. Verbal and non-verbal form of communication. Then a belief system, morals, customs, norms, values, and mores. There are 7 basic things to culture. So if you remember that, you will know, understand culture, because everyone has a culture, whether they're high culture, low culture, sophisticated culture, primitive culture, everyone, because culture is about action. That's what culture is about. It's about action. As John G. Jackson in his book, Introduction to African Civilization states, the culture is based upon what? Culture is based upon a patterned behavior. That's what culture is. And that patterned behavior is, how do you pattern your behavior through communication? Verbal, non-verbal form of communication. What's your belief system? Belief system doesn't mean, even if you're non-religious, you still have a belief. It may not be faith-based, but it's still a belief, nevertheless. So this is what's important. You've got morals, values, etc. These are socially constructed in order to harmonize and bring balance to a community, balance to a society. This is what happens. And all cultures do this in order to stabilize, not just the economy, stabilize the family structure, which, by the way, is the oldest institution known to man and woman or to humankind. That's the oldest institution. There's no institution older than the family. So this is what this is about. So this will be your exercise. This will be a task too for you to do. Just write down what you understand about these things. Do a little bit of research. Familiarize yourself with some of these historical terminologies. So this is just here. So this is looking at, in several instances in the Bible, however, Cush seems to refer to the location not in Africa. So Cush, which was from Africa, okay, you can call them East Africans today. You got Cush there. Okay, this is the names of that's the names of those groups in ancient times. You can see them in Arabia. So when we look at Ham, Shem, and Japheth, the story from the biblical text, they start them off here and then they fuse back in here. Okay, but they come at a much later date. So this thing where they have diffusion coming from Mesopotamia or Iraq back in, okay, it actually shows that those particular so-called racial groups are pretty accurate in its form of diffusion. Diffusion came back the other way. Okay, people started settled, high culture was developed, and they came back into other regions again to mix with those people who were there, your autochthonous groups. So here's Kush here, and you got Kush in Mesopotamia, which means that the first civilization was Sumeria. And the earliest civilization was Kush/Egypt or Kemet. So you have the earliest civilization with dark-skinned people. There was even civilizations here as well, okay, which are dark-skinned people. So these are the oldest civilizations known. So you have Ham, Shem, and Japheth. This is Ham. Ham is supposed to be the father of the dark races, okay? So Mizraim is Egypt. That was one of his sons. He settles in East Africa. Punt, there's still a difference of opinion where Punt is Libya or Somalia, but the reality is that it's still in Africa. Kush is East Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Eritrea, and all those places, right up into Kenya. We also got Kush in Arabia. We also have Kush in where? Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians are. This is important here. And Canaan is Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. So we know that dark-skinned people, they're finding dolichocephalic skulls in the Tufians of the Levant. They are now associated closely with the Nubian people or the dark-skinned people of Sudan. So we know that they had ventured out thousands of years ago and settled in those regions, etc. And this is how people start to develop. Now, how do you develop a civilization? Civilization, you have to have certain characteristics, certain behavioral patterns. You need to have an intelligentsia. You need to have doctors, medical doctors. You need to have scientists. Yeah, you need to have educators. You need to have priests. This is the intelligentsia. The next thing, in order to create a high culture, which is a civilization, is metallurgical skills. You need to have knowledge of tools to create things to make it easier for yourself, such as a knife. You move from flint to a metal instrument to cut things or to slaughter things. Okay, this is what happens. So people move from stone to metal. And this is how it happens. And when you come into the metal age, the metallurgical stage, you now start to see high structures being developed, high structures being built, and basically legal systems started to emerge as a result of that, you know, with values and customary practices, etc. This is how it comes. This is cultural evolution, where it begins. Cultural diffusion is where it spreads. That's the difference between evolution in history and diffusion. Diffusion is spreading, you know, to bring about influence. So here, who are the people of Sumer and the Sumerians? This is where we get the word Sumer from, okay? Runoko Rashidi, who's a historian who specializes in the African presence in antiquity. This is what he says. While Sumerians or Sumer's many cultural achievements are much celebrated, the important question of their ethnic composition is frequently glossed over or left out of discussion, which means that Sumeriologists do not want to acknowledge the Black presence of one of the first or the oldest civilizations known in the world. They want to attribute to other people who weren't even around at that time. This is what's important here. Sumer and Kush. I showed you on the map where Sumerian is, and where Kush was, where the family of Kush, the tribes of Kush went. They weren't just in East Africa, they were in the southern Arabia, they were also in what is known as Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. And it says here, these Sumerians, okay, or Ethiopians. Ethiopian, the word Ethiopia comes from a Greek word, which means what? Burnt face. Ops means facing Greece. Ethios means burnt, blackened, darkened. That's what it means, okay? So Sumerians and Ethiopians and their kindred appear to have settled, okay, along tracks from Mesopotamia to India. So when we look at those early civilizations, Sumer and Babylon, okay, Assyria and all those places up in Mesopotamia, we even have in India, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, okay? There are the Black civilizations that emerged at that time. So the earliest civilizations, high culture, was developed by darker-skinned people. And this is why it's important for us to know this, because Europeans didn't go through, because Africans for approximately 150,000 years had time to develop themselves, get into the metallurgical industries, to develop clothes, you know, and to start selling and trading in, you know, commercial enterprises, you know, commodity exchange with minerals, you know, and other forms of resources. This is how it comes about. So when we look at that, and it also goes on to say that this area now includes southern Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwest India. This was lived by dark-skinned people for thousands of years. The lighter-skinned people you see in these places now have only been there approximately, what, 3,000, maybe 4,000 years. And we know when they came in, because the oral traditions that they have with the Aryans coming in from the Caucasus Mountains into the equatorial regions like Mesopotamia, Afghanistan, Persia, all these were Black lands. And when they came in at a much later date, they came in around about 150 BC to about 70 BC. So, and the skulls actually substantiate this as well. We don't see these skulls of different groups of people coming into those regions until much later. So this is just to show you the Hindu Kush Mountains in Kabul, in Afghanistan, etc. So this is just additional information I just want you to go through. The elder civilization of the region was established by the Assyrians. They are designated in the Assyrio-Babylonian inscriptions as the Blackheads or the Black-faced people. Ethiopia means black face, okay? Sumeria, Ethiopia, the same people, they're Cushitic people, okay? It's an adjective, it's a descriptive word. This is how this comes about. And then obviously you got the likes of Nama. Nama is the person, he's Cushitic, he's what you call Ethiopian or Sudanese. He was the one that unites the two lands of Upper and Lower Kemet, which we now call Egypt, okay? And he builds the kingdom. You can see his face, wide nostrils, his thick lip, is an African. He is the founder of what we now know as the first dynasty. Egypt went to either 30 or 33 dynasties, depending on your interpretation. Then we got Kemet, okay? The Kemetic people, what do they say? This is the papyrus of Hunefer. We came from the beginning of the Nile, where God happy dwell at the foothill of the mountain of the moon, Mount Kilimanjaro. That's where the Egyptians said they come from. So when we go back to genetic evidence, I show you how the Egyptians moved, the Berbers moved from the linguistic and now the West African, the Chaldaic languages got into Central and West Africa. Okay. Egypt, they migrated. So the linguistic evidence substantiate what the Egyptians themselves say in their papyrus. So the Egyptians are not white as people would like to make out. They came white later on with invasions, with allothenous groups coming in and settling, okay? But it didn't bring much in the way of contribution, if you look at it, because that was a high civilization. They absorbed that and they maintained that and preserved that. They didn't bring in anything. Okay, this is what's important if we look at ancient Egyptian civilization. Because the first group of invaders that come into Africa was the Hyksos, approximately 1650 BC. And then the Assyrians, who were light-skinned people, Indo-Europeans who were living in places like Mesopotamia, spread. They came in around about 662 to 663. Then the Persians came in, the Cambyses, around about 525. Then Alexander of Macedonia comes in approximately 332 BC. The Romans then come in later on, so you see how it gets lighter, okay? And they become the ruling class, but there's still a dark population there. They may not be in the seats of power, but their systems is now being absorbed, being used by these interlopers or allothenous groups of people who've migrated there. Okay, this is what's important. So the Egyptians saying it came from the south, from the southern part of Africa to the eastern part. This is what they're basically saying. Okay, so this is how they would have journeyed. They would have come from here. You saw Kush there, Kenya's a bit further down. This is how they diffused, okay, and they became the first settlers. There are allothenous groups of people, but they diffused from East Africa, diffusion, they spread, and then they settled. But they were the autochthonous or the indigenous people. The Greco-Roman, they are allothenous, they come in much later. They may be native, but they're not indigenous. And this is how you understand this. Okay, this is Imhotep, you know, so I think I've gone through enough presentations just to give you an idea of genetics and how it mixes with history and anthropology and craniology and paleoanthropology, and the list just goes on and on. So I'll end my presentation here. Please, you know, refer to this presentation again, just to get some understanding or to help you with the tasks which I've given out. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. I hope I've clarified some misconceptions, and I hope that when I come in next week to do a talk on the conference, please have questions waiting for me to ask me. The most difficult questions are the best, the most stupid questions are even better, because they're usually questions that people don't like asking, which is necessary to answer. So please enjoy the tasks. I hope you've enjoyed the presentations. Sorry for being long-winded. I know it's beyond 20 minutes, but I cannot condense it into that. And I did say to the organizers that this may be a possibility. And that's it, all I can really say. Thank you very much and have a good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.